So, Spinoza on the eternity of the mind. In E5 P20 Scholium, Spinoza announces that he will now turn to that which concerns the duration of the mind without relation to the body. In the following proposition from proposition 21 to 32, he goes on to provide a very complex and somewhat enigmatic account of the eternity of the mind, describing it both in absolute terms as a function of having an essence and in scalar terms as a function of the adequate knowledge we possess. After that, he goes on to relate the third kind of knowledge to the intellectual love of God, ending with the development in the Scholium to the proposition 40, writing that these are the things I have decided to show concerning the mind, insofar as it is considered without relation to the body's existence. How are we to understand this doctrine of the eternity of the mind? Now, so here I would say something about the first part that I would do, which is about, I'll just kind of summarize what the conclusion is. It was this discussion that's been going on for a very long time about whether we should understand the eternity of the mind as something that's completely atemporal, or whether we should think of it as a sempiternity of the mind. And discussion that has been going on and on and on is always about a choice. It's either or. And my take on this is that I don't really think we need to choose. And I actually think we get a better doctrine out of Spinoza. We say that he actually has both. And there's 3 sections in the paper where I try to spell out how you can actually have both understandings, but I'm going to leave that out. You can read it for yourselves if you want to. So, and then in the second part of the paper, I will turn to Spinoza's distinction between two eternities of the mind, the ones I would call on the one hand absolute and the other one scalar. In that part of my paper, I'll be building on, but also modifying the influential readings of Spinoza's 2 eternities proposed by Dan Garber, by Stephen Nadler, and by Pierre-François Moreau. I will in particular stress how the classic distinction between the formal and the objective reality of the mind can do much work in accounting for the difference between absolute and scalar eternity. Since this is partly a polemical paper, before delving into Spinoza's text, I shall first briefly explain against whom and against what I'm arguing in the following. It is first of all the understanding of the eternity of the mind that one will find among commentators who consider Spinoza to be a kind of Platonist about essences. By Platonism, I here understand a doctrine according to which essences and existences exist on different levels, so to speak, or an ontology that contains 2 distinct levels, a level where the essences exist but not actually, and then another level where the existences actually exist. This kind of Platonizing approach to Spinoza's theory of essence and existence mainly hinges on a distinction allegedly found in Spinoza between the formal essence and the actual essence of things. Now, I have elsewhere put considerably energy into demonstrating that I think that this dichotomy between formal essence and actual existence is false. Now, if I'm right about that, this also implies that interpretations of Spinoza's conception of the eternity of the mind, just a second, eternity of the mind hinging on these Platonizing interpretations of Spinoza's ontology must be equally false. Now, this is particularly unfortunate to the extent that some recent readings of this kind have proven to become very influential. I have in mind here in particular some recent articles by Don Garrett. Hence, my aim is to show, against Platonizing approaches, how Spinoza's doctrine of the eternity of the mind can be construed in a systematically superior way without having recourse to ontological stratification. I will in particular stress how understanding both the difference between eternity and duration and the difference between absolute and scalar eternity in terms of aspects rather than levels or kinds can help achieve that. Okay, so now I'm going to jump a whole lot of pages until the section 5. Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is the relation between the 2 eternities that Spinoza speaks of in Ethics 5, namely the kind of absolute eternity that he ascribes to all things, including man and the human mind, and then the scalar kind of eternity that he ascribes to the human mind to the extent that it has adequate knowledge of the second and third kind, and which when it takes up the greater part of our cognition, makes up for, he says, a mind whose greatest part is eternal. Now, I'll first say a bit about how some other commentators have approached the question. Rather than taking here the more straightforward polemical route and develop my position in direct opposition to the kind of interpretations that I disagree most with, that is the sort of heavily Platonizing ones like Garrett's, I'd rather go for maximum precision by considering how I would differ from those available readings that I otherwise find very congenial. I will thus here mainly develop my interpretation in juxtaposition to three commentators, who all, to my mind, have come a long way in getting it right. So first, Pierre-François Moreau in Spinoza and L'Expérience et l'Éternité, where he distinguishes between an absolute and a differential conception of the eternity of the mind. Dan Geiber then, in an article from 2005, who distinguishes between a minimal and what he calls a fuller notion of eternity. And then finally, Steve Nadler, who in his two books on Spinoza's heresy and Spinoza's ethics, provides what is arguably the most developed English language commentary on the topic currently available. In all three readings, although they differ in other respects, absolute, or in Dan's vocabulary, minimal eternity, relates to the simple fact that all things have essences and that God's intellect eternally includes ideas of those essences. The differential, or what Dan calls the fuller eternity, on the contrary, is subject to variation and is specific to human minds, or minds of human-like complexity anyway, and hinges on the degree to which our cognition is adequate. Now, my aim in these sections is to spell out the relation between these two eternities of the mind. So I want to solve a problem that Dan in his paper points to, although the solution I will suggest is somewhat different from his. Hence, cautiously, Dan remarks in his paper from 2005, I should remark here that it is not absolutely clear that Spinoza carefully distinguishes what seems clearly to be a second kind of eternity from the minimal eternity I discussed earlier. But despite the fact that Spinoza himself may not clearly distinguish these two grades of eternity, they really are quite distinct. Dan goes on to stress that all this is enormously puzzling, so I will not nitpick about the exact wording of his remarks here. But I do find it both important and possible to spell out a little bit more what such a distinction in kind can or cannot consist in. Most importantly, I believe we must try and avoid any Platonizing stratification and grasp the relevant distinction in terms of aspects, so that absolute and scalar eternity are two aspects of one of the same eternity and not two different eternities, as it were. I will in particular suggest the distinction between the formal and objective reality of the mind can prove helpful in achieving that. So, for this purpose, I'm going to need some basic metaphysical distinctions. Let me briefly look at the definition of eternity and also the explication that follows that definition. Now, according to the definition of eternity in the first part of Ethics, eternity is existence itself insofar as it is conceived to follow necessarily from the definition alone of an eternal thing. In the explication of that definition, Spinoza adds to this that such existence, like the essence of a thing, is conceived as an eternal truth. Now, I'm kind of interested in how those two passages relate. Why does Spinoza move from speaking about eternal things in the definition to speak about eternal truths in the explication? Now, let us first recall what Spinoza understands by truth. He provides no definition, but according to the axiom 4 of the first part, a true idea must agree with its object, and in definition 4 of the second part, he defines an adequate idea as an idea which, insofar as it is considered in itself without relation to its object, has all the properties or intrinsic denominations of a true idea. Now, from those two passages, it is reasonably clear that by truth, Spinoza understands the relation an adequate idea upholds to its object. In light of this, it seems reasonable enough to suggest that in this context, by an eternal truth, Spinoza understands an idea that represents something eternal, or that the eternal truth about a thing X is an intellectual representation of what is eternal, the case about X. Hence it appears that between the definition 8 and its explication, Spinoza changes from an ontological register concerning eternal things to an epistemological one concerning eternal truths. In the explication, we're no longer dealing in eternal things, but in representations, that is to say, ideas about eternal things or eternal truths. Now, I think this double register that Spinoza appeals to when defining eternity in definition 8, in terms on the one hand of the eternity of things themselves and on the other in terms of the eternal truth of the ideas bearing upon them, it is crucial for explaining the difference between the two aspects of the eternity of the mind that Spinoza later envisages in part 5. So first, the absolute aspect of eternity. As most commentators agree, correctly I think, this absolute kind of eternity relates to the fact that all things, including the body and the mind that form a man, are endowed with an essence. This essence is eternal, and the idea of that essence is an eternal truth. As such, there's nothing scalar about that essence and nothing scalar about the eternity of the truth that is about it. What we have is a fixed and determinate formal essence contained in some divine attribute, and correspondingly, a fixed and determinate idea of that formal essence comprehended in the divine intellect. Now, Spinoza argues in E2P8 that such an essence is conceived as an eternal truth in the divine intellect, no matter whether the thing exists or not. This is, by the way, in the previous sections that I didn't read, what I think that the sempiternity of the human mind in Spinoza consists in. That is, that there is always an idea of all things in God. They are all comprehended in God's idea, as Spinoza puts us in 2P8, including of all bodies, no matter whether those bodies currently exist or not. That's the sempiternity of the mind. Now, the difficulty consists in separating that kind of constant presence in the divine intellect of the idea of the essence, so that is the sempiternity of divine ideas, from the absolute eternity of essences. Now, Dan, for example, appears to me somehow to sort of confound them. Hence he writes, as I read Spinoza, my eternal existence is an idea in God's infinite intellect. I exist eternally insofar as my individual essence is an eternal object of God's thought. Similarly, according to Stephen Nadler, the internal part of the mind just is the idea of a non-existing material thing. Now, but I do not see how this can be right, for two reasons. First, I do not see how we can equate the eternity of the mind with the fact that the ideas of all things remain in the divine intellect. This constant presence is not eternity, but sempiternity, because it's a kind of temporal permanence of ideas which are always comprehended in God's idea, no matter whether the object of idea currently exists or not. You can see how the temporal indexes tend to accumulate here. Yeah. Second, Spinoza is adamant about the fact that he does not consider divine ideas to be essences. We see this in 1P17 Scholium in particular, when Spinoza, by a long argument ad absurdum, ferociously opposes making the intellect part of the divine nature, such as we find it in Maimonides, for example. Indeed, by making of the divine intellect an infinite mode, or immediate infinite mode, rather than an attribute in E1P31, he's actually quite clear that in the order of things, ideas in the divine intellect always come after essences, as it were, or that divine ideas are ideas about essences, the truth of which is grounded in the fact that those essences were there in the first place. So essences are not contained in any intellect, although they are comprehended or understood by the intellect. They are contained in the divine attributes. So in sum, I do not see how the absolute eternity of the mind can be equated with some constant presence of the idea of the body in the divine intellect, because it amounts to explaining eternity through infinite duration and mistaking the divine intellect for the attribute of thought. It is important to stress again what Spinoza himself says in the Scholium to the proposition 23 in the fifth part, that, namely that our mind, insofar as it involves the essence of the body under the aspect of eternity, is eternal, and this existence it has cannot be defined by time or explained through duration. So we must rigorously avoid any association of eternity to temporal categories, avoiding any connotation to some kind of existential permanence. Indeed, as one might say, kind of half a pun of Althusser, eternity can last as long as you want, for a moment or for a long time. It is simply irrelevant to its constitution, which is rigorously atemporal. As Spinoza already writes in the Cogitata Metaphysica, none will ever say that the essence of a circle or a triangle, insofar as it is an eternal truth, has endured longer now than it had in the time of Adam. But this is an insight that even readings that insisting most strongly on the atemporality of eternity often do manage to fully incorporate. See it, for example, with Stephen Nanda, after having stressed that eternity is not sempiternity, then goes on and writes about the mind insofar as it is the idea of the essence of the body, that this aspect of the mind is eternal. It is, therefore, a part of the mind that remains after a person's death. Now, my grievance here, of course, bears on this unfortunate therefore, which quite straightforwardly involves an illegitimate inference from eternity to prolonged duration at a crucial point in his account. So what is eternity then, if it is not what Nadler suggests? Well, maybe in order to understand, instead of insisting on ontological categories, we should turn to modal ones and focus on Spinoza's assimilation of eternity to necessity. In the demonstration of E2 P44 Corollary 2, where Spinoza first introducing the expression sub specie eternitatis, he explains, "It is of the nature of reason to regard things as necessary, and it perceives this necessity truly, that is, as it is in itself. But this necessity of things is the very necessity of God's eternal nature. Therefore, it is of the nature of reason to regard things under this aspect of eternity." The same close connection, or even identity, of eternity and necessity is always also clear from E4 P62D, where Spinoza writes this. I'm glad you actually have the text so you can see the references. So E4 P62D, where Spinoza writes this, and you have to note the revealing use of the conjunction seu. Whatever the mind conceives under the guidance of reason, it conceives under the same aspect or eternity, aeternitas seu necessitata species, and is affected with the same certainty. So whether the idea is of a future or past thing, or of a present one, the mind conceives the thing with the same necessity and is affected with the same certainty. Now, from these two passages, it is clear that for Spinoza to regard things under the aspect of eternity is nothing but grasping what is necessary about those things. Modally, we should presumably understand such conception of necessity in opposition to the kind of incomplete conception that Spinoza in E4D4 defines his conception as possible. In other words, conceiving things under the aspect of eternity amounts to grasping that those things necessarily are what they are and that they cannot be otherwise. Now in Spinoza, that in virtue of which a thing or an individual is what it is, or that in virtue of which it can be said to be and remain identical to itself, is also what he calls its form. It's a notion that he, true to his Cartesian heritage, develops in deliberate opposition to the scholastic conception of form in terms of faculties and finality as something that rather relates to the thing's mechanical or causal properties. Such mechanical properties do not express the nature of things in terms of faculties, potentiality, possibility, or finality, that is to say, in terms of what the thing can or should be, but rather express what a given thing actually is. Now, when it comes to bodies, this actual, mechanically defined form is for Spinoza described as a characteristic ratio of motion and rest. Hence, according to some well-known passages in the so-called physical digression in the second part, what constitutes the form of the individual consists in the union of the bodies, and an individual or one body is composed when a number of bodies, as he says, communicate their motions to each other in a certain fixed manner. Now, Spinoza is not particularly clear about what such form consists in when it comes to mental things, such as minds, except then establishing in E2P21 that the form of the mind is the idea of the mind, is the idea of the idea. I'm not quite sure it's the same notion of form here, but there's some discussion to be had. But parallelism, which stipulates that the order of connection of ideas is the same as that of the things they represent, induces us to think that the mental equivalent of bodily ratio must be some sort of fixed and determined relation between ideas. But we need not get further entangled here in that particular discussion. All we should note is that the form of the mind constitutes that through which it is necessarily identical to itself, and that Spinoza speaks of such necessary self-identity in terms of eternity in E2 P44 Corollary 2. It appears then as if Spinoza was telling us that eternity itself does not consist in the fact that something remains the same through time, but in the fact that at whatever moment or period we could choose to consider something, it will at that moment or that period necessarily be what it is in virtue of its form, in such a way that the eternity of the things must be read not horizontally in time, as identity in time, but vertically, as it were, as necessary self-identity of form at any given moment, or what we can say, I think this is a pretty precise mode to express it, what it necessarily is now. Spinoza has some important, I think, interesting uses of that kind of expressions, necessary now. We can talk about that later. So in this way, the eternity of a thing is nothing but the necessity of the form through which it is conceived as an eternal truth. Its conception is, in a sense, rigorously tautological. Like when in definition 9 on the first part, Spinoza defines eternity by reference to the definition of an eternal thing. At every given moment, or necessarily now, all things are eternally conceived adequately what they are in virtue of their form. And this form is the internal mechanical, as it were, construction of the mind as a mode, that is, a characteristic configuration of mental causes constituted within the attribute of thought, which is nothing but the formal reality of the mind as a mode. To return to expression in E5 P20S, with which I began, this formal reality is also what the eternity of the mind amounts to when considered without relation to the body. It is also the eternity of the mind that above I qualified as absolute. I think this is about as far as we will get with this. And now I have to turn to the next question I wanted to address and try and understand what the eternity of the mind might then amount to when it is considered with a relation to the body. That is, when we consider the mind from the perspective of its representative content or its objective reality. So, next section. So, in this last section, I want in particular to point out that the scalar eternity of the mind does not, as Dan tentatively suggested, refer to another kind of eternity than the absolute one. So here I'm actually a little bit nitpicking that term, so sorry about that. Now, I think it refers to exactly, doesn't refer to another kind. It refers to exactly the same eternity of the mind as the absolute one, albeit from another perspective, as it were. More precisely, I suggest that whereas the absolute notion of eternity of the mind refers to the formal reality of the mind as a mode of the attribute of thought, that is, the mind as an eternal formal essence contained in the attribute of thought, the scalar notion of eternity must be understood beginning from the objective reality of the human mind insofar as it is a part of divine intellect, that is, the mind as an eternal truth about the body. Now, in order to gain some clarity about this point, we have to consider briefly the notion of formal essence that we found in E2P8 Scholium, as Spinoza uses to designate objects contained in the divine attributes and that correspond to the ideas of non-existing things that are comprehended in the divine intellect. So how are we to understand this notion of formal essence? Now, the platonizing reasons that constitute my main opponents in this paper here suggest that we should oppose the formal essences in E2P8 to the actual essences that Spinoza speaks of elsewhere in his work in Proposition 7 of the third part, when developing his conception of the conatus, or perseverance in existence, that he identifies as the actual essence of those things. This approach leads to grasping formal essences, a kind of potentialities or even possibilities somehow contained in divine attributes, sort of waiting to be actualized and thus being brought into real or actual existence. For example, Don Garrett writes in a recent article that the formal essence of a thing constitutes in some way the possibility or actualizability of that thing. Now, such a reading of the notion of formal essence is, to my mind, mistaken. Spinoza fiercely combats the idea that notions of possibility or potentiality, no matter how they are presented or formulated, have any ontological import whatsoever. If those terms are to have any meaning, it is only epistemologically, as specific ways of ignoring the determining causes of something. For Spinoza, things exist or they do not for determinate reasons or causes. There is no in-between. There's no such thing as inactual existence distinct from the actual one. It simply makes no sense to speak of formal essences that are not actual and yet still exist in some unspecified, non-actual sense. Moreover, from the immediate context of Spinoza's use of the term of formal essence in E2P8 Scholium, it is quite clear that the relevant dichotomy is not between formal and actual essence, which Spinoza never juxtaposed, but between formal essence and objective being. Hence, in E2P8 Corollary, that is, immediately after introducing formal essences, Spinoza further explains that so long as singular things do not exist, except insofar as they are comprehended in God's attributes, their objective being or ideas do not exist except insofar as God's infinite idea exists. So, clearly, following the standard Cartesian distinction between the formal and objective reality of things, Spinoza speaks of the formal essence in order to distinguish the way a thing or mode is formally contained in some attribute from the way in which that same thing is represented objectively in the divine intellect. In short, Spinoza speaks of formal essence in order to distinguish the essence itself from the idea of the essence, that is, the objective being. Now, following this particular configuration of terms, how I'm doing for time here?
Maybe 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Oh,
Sorry, it's just
That's fine.
yes, one more? 10.
Okay, 10. Thank you. I'll try and... Okay, so following this configuration of terms, we should try and identify the following three notions. First is formal essence of the body, which is a mode of the attribute of extension. Next, there is the formal essence of the mind, which is a mode of the attribute of thought. And finally, there is the objective being of the body or idea, which is an idea comprehended in the divine intellect. Now, this idea is, as we know, nothing but the mind itself. Hence, the mind has two distinct aspects. On the one hand, formally, the mind is something, that is a mode contained in the attribute of thought, and on the other hand, objectively, the mind is of something, namely the idea of the body comprehended in the divine intellect. Now, the formal essence of the mind is absolutely eternal, just like the formal essence of the corresponding body in the attribute of extension is absolutely eternal. This eternity of the mind and the body is to be understood in terms of the necessarily self-identity of their forms, as I said before. However, to the extent that the human mind is a part of the divine intellect and contains an objective reality, it is also a representation of the body. Now, considered from this angle, the human mind is not a form given within the attribute of thought, but an idea of the human body given in the intellect of God. That idea, insofar as it is considered a part of the intellect of God, is an eternal truth, because it is an idea of an eternal thing. And there's nothing scalar about it to the extent that it pertains to God. God's idea of any human body is an eternal truth that is just as absolutely eternal as is the form of the body of which it is the idea. Moreover, it is an idea or eternal truth that is sempiternally comprehended in the divine intellect, no matter whether the corresponding body exists or not. However, if we consider the human mind in itself, apart from the infinite divine intellect of which it is a part, that is considered as a finite intellect, things present themselves differently. In this case, the mind can represent its own object, the body, in two distinct ways. How? Spinoza writes in Scholium to the Proposition 29, we conceive things as actual in two ways, either insofar as we conceive them to exist in relation to a certain time and place, or insofar as we conceive them to be contained in God and to follow from the necessity of the divine nature. But the things we conceive in this second way as true or real, we conceive under the aspect of eternity, and to that extent they involve the eternal and infinite essence of God. So, All things have these two distinct aspects, which are, as it were, existential and essential. All those things whose essence does not include existence, that is all modes, have an existential aspect which is read horizontally in duration and time. Either they actually exist or they actually do not exist, where we actually should here be understood in the sense of currently. Any conceivable mode either currently exists or does not currently exist. These same modes, however, also have an essential aspect which is read vertically, that is according to the necessity of the form. Spinoza maintains that this aspect is also actual. The actuality of form is, however, not actuality in sense of currently. It is rather actuality as opposed to potential or possible. The actuality of the form is the necessity of that form as opposed to the scholastic conception of form as potentiality and possibility or some finality aimed at. So in sum, actuality of existence on the one hand equals current existence or existing now, and the actuality of essence on the contrary equals the necessity of form or the fact that things necessarily are what they currently are. Conceiving things in this latter essential sense is also, as we have already seen in relation to E2P44 corollary 2, that things are under the aspect of eternity. Now, what we further learn in the scholium to the proposition 29 that I just read before is that not only do things have these aspects, but that those aspects correspond to two ways of conceiving them. So either duobis modis and nobis concipiantur. Hence, we are no longer just considering what duration and eternity are, formally in the attributes, but how duration and eternity are conceived objectively in the intellect as two distinct ways of conceiving things as durational or eternal. And the question is how this distinction plays out when the thing under consideration is ourselves, that is to say, when we apply this distinction to the way in which the mind conceives its own object, the body. I'm not going to spell out here the way that the epistemology works in detail here. Actually, Dan did quite a lot of that yesterday. But the point Spinoza is trying to get at is, of course, that when our mind grasps its object, that is the body, according to the so-called first kind of cognition, that means the imagination, we conceive of ourselves under the aspect of duration or as durational. This is because the imagination is cognition based on the imagination of things which represent bodies to our mind as present, that is to say, as currently or actually existing. When, however, we conceive ourselves adequately by a second or third kind of cognition, reason or intuition, we rather conceive ourselves under the aspect of eternity as eternal. For, as Spinoza already established in the corollary 2 of proposition 44 in the second part, it is of the nature of reason to perceive things under a certain aspect of eternity. For this reason, Spinoza writes in the demonstration of proposition 29 in the fifth part, that when the mind conceives of itself adequately, it pertains to the nature of the mind to conceive the body's essence under a species of eternity. Okay, 2 minutes and I should be done. It is, however, sometimes the case that we grasp ourselves in one way and sometimes the case that we grasp ourselves in the other. Sometimes we are in the grip of passions when we fear and hope, hate and love, according to the way in which our encounters with other things affect our ability to conserve our existence in duration. Here, our cognition of ourselves remained governed by the imagination, by our experience of our present selves or the recollection of our former ones. It is under this aspect that we conceive imaginatively that kind of perpetuation of the self along with all its experiences and recollections, the indefinition prolongation of which religion and the common opinion of men traditionally associate with the immortality of the soul. But sometimes, on the contrary, we do manage to contemplate ourselves as what we necessarily are now. That is to say, the essential actuality of ourselves, which is nothing but the eternity and necessity of our form. When we do that, we do nothing but understand ourselves exactly as God understands us, or rather, quite literally, our understanding of ourselves just is God's understanding of us, insofar as our intellect is part of the divine one. And the relative proportion between these two ways of conceiving ourselves, imaginary and intellectual, determines whether it is the greater or smaller part of the mind that is eternal, according to the scale or notion of the eternity of the mind. But as should be clear, the scalar conception of the eternity of the mind pertains to the mind's objective reality, the way in which it is constituted as a representation of the body, that is, as a reputation of its existence or its essence. So I'll conclude. Hence, we can sum up as follows the way in which the distinction between the formal and the objective can help getting a better grip of the difference between the absolute and the scalar eternity of the mind. From the point of view of its formal reality, or what it is in itself without relation to the body, the human mind is absolutely eternal in virtue of the necessity of its own formal essence. However, from the point of view of the objective being it contains, with respect to what it represents, comprehends, the human mind is only eternal to the extent that it expresses the eternal truth about its own object, that is to say, the formal essence of the body, or the essential actuality of the body's form. To the extent, however, that it expresses the durational aspect of the body, that is, the actuality of the body's existence, it does not express an eternal truth. Thus, as Spinoza himself sums up the difference in the Proposition 29, whatever the mind understands under the aspect of eternity, it understands not from the fact that it conceives the body's present actual existence, but from the fact that it conceives the body's essence under the aspect of eternity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans, for this wonderful paper. And now we have a few minutes for questions. This is Professor Garber.
Thank you very, very much. This is extraordinarily dense, not because of your paper, but simply because the material itself is just so difficult. But I'm not sure that I caught it completely. I'm going to have to look this over very carefully later. But I don't immediately see. I mean, for me, the problem was always, in EP by E5P23. There is a part that is eternal, which is connected with our with the idea of our nature and our God's intellect. But then we can become more of a greater, insofar as we gain more and more adequate ideas, the greater part of the mind becomes eternal. And that for me was always the question to understand in Ethics 5. But I don't see how it is that you understand the second part of that, the idea that the more and more adequate ideas that somebody gains, the greater part of the mind.
I think it sort of comes back to distinction that I try to make. What is distinction between eternity and eternal truths? Where I think that if you look at the mind's eternity of the self is something that relates to the formal reality of the mind. I mean, what it is, or rather to the formal reality of it and what it is in the attribute of thought. It's a mode of thought. It has an essence in there, and that essence is eternal, and there's nothing scalar about that.
And that's P23.
Yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, I can't really remember exactly when he shifted from the one to the other, but I think,
But that's
23.
At the beginning.
When he says that we feel that we're eternal. I think that's sort of the thing that he refers to there. But on the other hand, the scalar kind of thing is not about it's not about the formal reality of our mind, it's about the objective reality of it, of what the mind is, insofar it is a part of the intellect of God rather than a mode of the attribute of thought. When you look at the mind, because your mind has these two aspects, it's both a mode of thought and
It represents something.
And represents something. And it's when you start to consider the mind as something that represents something that you have this scalar thing that comes in, because sometimes the mind represents itself as an actual existing thing. And when it represents itself as an actual existence, well, then it's sort of steeped in duration, because that existence is durational. And when it does that, well, it's not eternal. It doesn't have this scalar kind of eternal. However, when it starts to consider itself in this other way, when it starts to consider what is the absolute aspect of what is the form, or what is this what the mind is eternally as an essence, but I think is some sort of necessity of the form. If it starts to consider itself what it is necessarily now, then when it does that, then the mind is eternal in the scalar kind of sense. So that's where I want to make the distinction. I want to make the distinction between the absolute and the scalar way conceptions of the eternity of the mind as a difference between the two aspects of the mind. On the one hand, the formal reality of the mind, and the other hand, the objective reality of the mind. I think that sort of was the idea. Does that make sense?
We'll have to talk more later.
Yeah.
Yes, please. And then you wonderful.
Thank you for George P. Professor Beck. Lerke. I agree with your distinction concerning the eternal consideration. That distinction adds us to understand more, to understand better these propositions, which are very difficult. Us for a comfortable lecture of Spinoza, but I ask you, it's just a theoretical question. Which effects in the practical life, in social order, can be deduced of your view? It's a question interesting for a common people. How this question could affect the vulgus?
Yeah. So this, thank you very much. I think it's a very good question. It's something that I sort of thought an awful lot about. I think, but I think there's two things to say here. On the one hand, I don't think it's something that Spinoza will affect the vulgus, because this is all too half. This is something that concerns the wise man. And the vulgus will remain steeped in his notions about immortality of the soul. And actually, Spinoza seems to be pretty happy about that. When you look at the TTP and you have the tenets of universal faith, the thing about perpetuating the life after death seems to be an essential part of what he thinks is the religio catholica, used for the common people to aspire to being good with the help of religion. So I don't think this is something that concerns the common man. But what is the practical upshot of this for the wise man then? Well, actually, maybe it comes back to, this is probably going to come out a little bit trivial, but I think it lies when you grasp yourself as eternal. What I wanted to say, you grasp yourself as eternal, you grasp your own identity. It's a question of grasping your own self-identity now and affirming your own self-identity in this moment. So there is this kind of sense of not living in view of something else, but kind of living in the moment kind of thing going on. Yeah, that's why I said trivial, okay? But I think there's something important. I think there's an important practical upshot to Spinoza's way of juggling around with this basically modal category of necessity now. So.
Please.
This is great. I'm very happy that you're putting this out there because I think I'm totally in agreement with you.
Okay, good. That's a start.
That's what I'm saying. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to think about that different this.
Okay, great.
And I really think you can drive home this formal, your point about the formal essences and the actual essences, just by pointing to the context of 2P8 and saying, look, 2P7 introduces this sort of parallelism. What's the point? In God's infinite intellect, there's what objectively real representations correspond to what's formally real about existing things. 2P8 just extends the point to say God's infinite intellect also has ideas about things that, because of the causal order of nature, don't exist. So, anyway, that's very exciting.
Yeah. So Okay, so there was this thing about 2p8. So I actually wrote another really quite long paper about 2p8 and trying to understand what does it mean to have a conception of a non-existing thing. And the point of it, I was trying to combine it with, it's one of the very, very few places where I actually get on the PSR train here. So I think we have to stress this thing about that there has to be a reason, and he says this thing that there has to be a cause and a reason, not just for the existence of things, but also for the non-existence of things. So what does that mean? Well, it means that when God conceives of a thing that does not exist, well, it doesn't mean that he just conceives of the thing. He actually conceives of the thing as non-existing. So he conceives of the thing along with all the things that are the causes of the fact that it doesn't exist. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't conceive of the thing. He does conceive of the thing. I mean, so for example, use the example of the ice cream, the dessert I ate yesterday. Okay, so the dessert I ate yesterday, there is still in God, of course, there's an adequate idea of the dessert I had yesterday, and I can sort of tap into that idea in the divine intellect, or actually have the idea of the dessert I had yesterday. But if that idea is to be adequate, it has to be not an idea of the dessert I ate yesterday as existing, because it's no longer there. I ate it. So in order for my idea of the ice cream I ate yesterday to be adequate, it has to include the cause of its non-existence, namely me. So that's the way you have to think about those, which involve, when you think about things in that way, you include this idea that you have to include in the adequate conception of non-existing things the causes of their non-existence. If you do that, then you get rid of all this platonizing, where you think about the adequate ideas about things that do not exist, ideas about non-actual like essences or whatever it is that they're all on about. So.
Okay. Yes. Please.
Well, I love it very much, your paper. I enjoy it. And I want to ask you if this relation with the current formal existence and objective being, etc., is not a way to put the idea, the Spinozan idea of the remain in the existence, ¿cómo se dice? Permanecer en el remain in the being, remain in being. So I see that it is really strong connected with the necessity you are underlying there, you know. The things have that necessity, and if you can take this to parts of the thing, it's very important to put remain in the being.
Yeah.
Spinoza.
Yeah. Thank you. So when you use the word remain, I mean, his uses of the word remain is kind of interesting. Raphael Lambeau wrote a very nice paper about the way that Spinoza uses the word remain in the second part of the Ethics in relation to the physical digression. However, in this connection, I was mainly interested in the way he uses the word, but that's the bit that I didn't read because I didn't have the time. When he used the word remain, that there's things of he says these things about when the body dies, there are bits of the mind that remain. How are we supposed to understand that thing? And the way that commentators until now, or at least most commentators, I'm thinking of Steve Nadler, the way that Steve Nadler looks at this, that he seems very keen on connecting this remaining business here to the eternity of the mind. And I think that's really problematic. For me, remaining is too temporally indexed. However, it's there. So what do you do with it? I mean, so my point was, my view on this was to say, maybe we can have our cake and eat it, and both have the sempiternity of the mind and the eternity of the mind. So what would the difference between them be? Well, what I think is that on the one hand, we have the eternity of the mind that Spinoza actually tends to define in nodal categories. So I would define the eternity, absolute eternity of the mind in terms of the formal essence of the mind, what the mind is, or the formal reality of the mind in the attribute of thought, in terms of this necessary self-identity of form in the present moment, sort of in depth kind of understanding. So in terms of the necessity of what I am now. And then on the other hand, the sempiternity, which is something that relates to what the idea is, what the mind is, again, insofar as it is in the intellect of God. And the fact is that there is always in God, so temporally indexed, always in God, an idea of the thing, whether it exists or not. So now we're back to the ideas of non-existing things, because there is in God always an idea of the ice cream I ate yesterday, whether it be coexisting. That means yesterday it was coexisting until I ate it. Then in God there was the idea of the ice cream qua non-existing, but the idea is always there, and that is the sempiternity of the mind, I think. Does that? And it gives an understanding to what it means for the mind to remain. Yeah.
Bueno, agradecemos mucho a Mogen su participación y los esperamos en la siguiente charla. Muchas gracias.